Secrets of Earth is by far my oldest work I have in my creative arsenal. I started working on it way back in 2013, nearing the end of my middle school experience. It started out as a self-insert piece of an actual interaction I had with a friend all those years ago. Those old drawings in my notebook filled my days with more than enough whimsy to write well over a dozen stories. It started out as what-ifs for my friend and I, with powerful Avatar-like abilities, despite the fact I had never seen Avatar: The Last Airbender before. However, the premise over that year evolved past the original self-fiction that I was writing at the time. It developed into an actual character with her own motives and goals. She became the guardian of Earth itself, and she gained all the cliché abilities of earth, fire, wind, and became needlessly Mary Sue-esque, as all first characters typically do, in my opinion. Her adventures were almost nonsensical, and never based around any actual story. It's a trend that still haunts my way of writing Secrets of Earth to this day. I called her Tulip because I love simple naming conventions, and it was a flower that I grew up loving. And with that, she filled my every waking thought whenever I happened to be listening to music. Music has always been a way to connect myself to my characters and allow me to express the way that characters interact with their world and each other. Tulip is one of my most dear characters I have ever made, because of the fact that she is my first original character. Her design has always been simple, based on white tulips and my own perception of myself. She was a cheery, pun-loving, and friendly person, before my twisted mind would eventually give her the one thing that haunts all preteen characters: trauma. During my high school years, I would finally write her a cohesive story with a technical villain and a couple of actual themes to base the story around. However, the story would have several problematic elements that in recent years I am currently working on fixing while I rewrite her story. Returning to her design, as I said before, Tulip was simply designed in almost every aspect. It reflected the lack of ability I had during those days, but she was a fairly solid design, if you ignore the context surrounding her character entirely. She has a long white dress with a blue line that wraps around her waist and lines the front of her skirt. Tulip, like myself, has long blonde hair and blue eyes. Her most unique trait of all, that I had never seen before at the time, was her green-stained hands that were supposed to represent the earthly powers that she was able to wield. These traits, in my mind, were unique since I was not engaged in very communities as young children usually are, especially when it comes to the internet nowadays. I also didn't have very many friend groups growing up because I was constantly on the move myself. But all in all, her design was fairly clean compared to other characters that I have seen over the years from kids of a similar age range. But, in my opinion, all first characters are never meant to be in their perfect forms off the get-go. There are a few problems now that I am a more experienced artist that make Tulip's design fairly weak in execution, and made the first redesign of this iteration very important to me. She lacked any identifiable character, she had no strong silhouette, and her design tells you nothing about her at all. A lot of her character becomes dependent on the various ways her abilities change the way her appearance looks, depending on the type of elemental ability it was. A couple of her forms would take her out of a dress and into some pants. Her hair would change lengths depending on what I had once thought reflected her abilities aesthetically, or in some cases would change her form altogether, like she would become a mermaid in her water form, and at one point she could transform into a humanoid rabbit. When I decided to rework Tulip's design for her first iteration, I knew I wanted it to be something that keeps the spring themes intact, so the white dress had to stay. But how do you make her silhouette more interesting? After all, she was just wearing a practically skin-tight white dress. So I had considered leaning into the shape of tulips, since they were round and easy to express. But eventually, I would find more expressive shapes that followed that similar opening flower motif. I had also played around with the idea of changing how her blue accent was engaging with her outfit. I had considered turning it into something like a sash, or even potentially removing it altogether. Eventually, I settled onto the idea of expanding her dress off to the side like that of a ballroom gown to build out the shape of her silhouette. And in the construction of her outfit, her skirt was made up of 3 separate pieces that overlapped and were joined at the waist. And because the fabric was so stiff, the edges of the hems would be able to give additional silhouette details because they would be sticking out in various directions, creating a very dynamic movement potential. As for the blue detail accent, I ultimately decided to remove it from her outfit altogether. It just didn't play well with her design at all, not clashing color-wise, but more of it didn't really express anything in her character. It was really only there to break up the bunch of white in her dress, and I just really liked the color blue as a child. I have played with the idea of what it could have been. I had become very interested in trying to layer fabrics over characters, so playing around with how her dress drapes over herself, or even how additional fabric pieces would cover over her, was very appealing to her character. So I played around with this green plaid shawl, and with the combination of this new style of dress, she had a more youthful vibe to her compared to the older design, which was again very sleek, very elegant, and much more mature looking in comparison. Even more so, by shortening her dress to about her mid-calf length, I was able to introduce actual footwear into her design that would change her from being a barefoot hippie to a more outdoor-ready character. So I went with leg braces. It would act as a nice support since, like myself at the time, Tulip was always on the move. Tulip's design, however, does not remain static in her story. By the end of the story, Tulip changes into a more autumn-themed outfit. In my notebook, I had drawn several other forms to indicate she had varying levels of power. However, by the end of the original story I had composed in high school, this would be the form she ultimately stays in. Originally, this outfit was composed of nothing but stitched autumn leaves together into a shirt and pant combination. Unfortunately, I have grown to dislike this design an awful lot. It's extremely busy, and it's not that impressive of a concept. And it's not very easy to replicate for not even comics or even animation. However, what would I use to inspire a new design, to convey that same feeling of autumn and maturity? The answer is actually found in an art piece that I made for Valentine's Day last year. A piece where I forewent the leafy outfit altogether for an idea that I had for her more recently. Something comfortable that leaned into the embrace that her husband wouldn't mind burying his face into. The simplification of her color palette and the cute puffy sweater that I drew for Tulip in exactly the right vibe that she needed all along for this phase of her life. So I stole from myself, and I made her have a cute brown sweater with dark yellow accents and red pants. She does get to keep her leg braces from her spring design, since those are very important to the longevity of her activity. However, by the end of her story, she kind of becomes more dormant in activity in comparison, not moving around nearly as much as she had been. So while the redesign may not have been as drastic of a change, I think it's still an important process to share. Redesigning an OC like this is probably the hardest thing that some people can do, especially once they've grown really attached to their characters. But everybody grows up and changes and develops, so it's important to be able to recognize how we've become different people than who we once were. And because of these subtle changes, Tulip had become far removed from how So is in the present day. Secrets of Earth has matured into complex themes, often surrounding mental health and trauma. So while Tulip has always fit into the narrative, she needed some work desperately. So far, I have changed half of the story to change her character overall. While she's still fun-loving and friendly in the beginning, she's become mute. When her second arc rolls around, she begins to distrust humans a lot more because of the experiences she has after being taken advantage of by a scientist. The goal in the design changes were always to be able to show the warmth she had being shed away for cold, bitter distrust. She was no longer the person she once was, and the only person to vaguely remember what she was before her full change was the person she fell in love with midway through her story. But by all means, So is not a romance novel. There isn't much focus on the interpersonal relationships romantically. Most of the stories from here on feel more like a family drama instead. And while this episode, in hindsight, is more of a look at how things have come along versus a here's my designs in progress, I think it's still fun to recount how I've gotten to where I am with Tulip's changes and how much I changed as a person to make her different as a character. I tend not to spend too much time actually considering how these changes affect my character in the moment, but recounting them at least allowed me to reflect on how well I did in order to create that vibe of a visually compelling character. With this practice in place, I intend to take it through all of the main characters of So, maybe even show the design for characters that I've never even drawn before. So the design should lean into the fun that can be had while trying to impose that impact. So thank you for coming along on this journey. It was fun to be able to share the evolution of a character that has been with me through many moments in my life. Should you choose to stick around and subscribe, I shall see you again in the next video. See you on the crossroads. Bye-bye.